Money is central to all of our lives, but it's something that's often neglected when we think about the past. Did medieval people commonly use coins? Did they even have coins? How did they know what coins were worth? Today's guest, Rory Naismith, has written a book about how we made, used and thought about money in the early Middle Ages. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Welcome everybody to another episode of Future Imperfect with me, your host, Jason Kingsley. I am excited today because I'm speaking to somebody about the medieval period and bits and bobs like that. So Rory, would you please introduce yourself? Because that's the easiest way by far. Because if I have to read something out, it'd probably be wrong.
I'll do my best. I'm Rory Naismith. I'm Professor of Early Medieval English History at the University of Cambridge. I'm a Fellow of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, and I work a lot on medieval economy, medieval society, particularly in England, but also neighbouring areas around England and the rest of Western Europe.
Thank you very much. And you've got a most recent book, Making Money in the Early Middle Ages?
Yep, that's correct.
I presume that's available now from all good bookshops, etc.
It is indeed, yes. It's published by Princeton. It's been out since summer 2023, I think.
Cool. So one of the things I always find useful when talking about medieval is to kind of challenge some assumptions that people have. People sort of think it's like the modern day, only somehow put through a medieval filter. And I think when it comes to making money and coinage and the economy, it would be quite different. Is that fair to say? Would we recognise it in the same way?
I think that's right. I think that's actually a good point to start with, that people think of the medieval period as really just like now, except everything's a bit darker and muddier and nastier. And I think that I wouldn't say that's completely wrong when it comes to money, because in some ways it is a much simpler system, in some ways much more direct system. There isn't as much money around, at least in terms of coined money. But at the same time, while there are elements of familiarity, there are all sorts of ways in which things work along lines that are really quite surprising to us. And you can sometimes find parallels for them if you go delving off into anthropological literature, you look at other times and places. But if you're trying to think of, say, England or France or Italy, does it work in the same way we're familiar with now? The answer is mostly no, but they are still using coins and certain other kinds of money. They're just doing different things with it.
So as I understand it, depending on which part of the medieval you're talking about, of course, because if we're talking about 1,000 years and we're talking in summary here, but in the sort of high medieval period, did cash money, was it a big thing for the ordinary person, or is money something that's sort of more for posh people and wealthy people? Did ordinary people have coin purses, and were they going out buying turnips for pennies, or how did it work?
If you're talking about the High Middle Ages, by which I'd mean really 1100 to 1350-ish, broadly speaking, yes, cash does become much more widespread. It's used much more regularly by a larger proportion of people. And by the 13th century, especially the late 13th century, most people are dealing with it an awful lot. And there are all kinds of things that come with that. People become increasingly numerate. There's more evidence for accounting practices at very low levels of society. So even peasants, even very humble members of society, would be using pennies and halfpennies much more regularly. Having said that, there would also be some members of society, like aristocrats, major churches, major merchants, who would deal with much, much larger sums on a much, much more frequent basis. So it was still very polarized. I think what's different in the earlier Middle Ages, the period that I was focusing on before you get into that world where cash is really much, much more widespread, is that it is around, and most people dealt with it sometimes, but it was much less regular. And the interest is in how people bridge that gap between not having that much money, not dealing with it all that often, but still making ends meet, still making things work, which they evidently did.
So if we go back to sort of the Roman era, so pre-medieval, there's all sorts of debates about how catastrophic the Roman withdrawal from the islands of Britain actually were, and whether it was localized and what actually went on. But things changed. I think that's pretty clear. Things changed. Did they continue to use Roman money, Roman coins as such? And presumably, if nobody's making more coins, then some of them get lost, dropped for people to find later in metal detecting sessions. And there's a sort of a natural wastage of the actual physical coin. Is that something? Did they ever run out?
Well, in a word, yes. They had a very, very large monetary economy in the late Roman period. That's worth stressing, that there was a colossal amount of cash in circulation, probably as much as you had in early modern times, much, much later on. It was very, very rich in terms of especially base metal, bronze, brass, copper coins. Those were just ubiquitous. If you dig up any Roman site now, you will expect to find a good scattering of those from the 200s and 300s. So anyone who was anyone at all would use those an awful lot in the Roman period. You also had silver and gold coins for big ticket expenses, people who are buying property, paying their taxes, for high roller types to use much more regularly. So those are those two sectors going on. And in a sense, what happens in the early Middle Ages is the big one of the base metal coinage, that goes away, and it goes away pretty fast in the course of the 5th century. But the bit that consists of the silver and gold, that survives kind of on a reduced scale. In the immediate aftermath of the ending of Roman Britain in the 400s and 500s, there's really not much coin of any sort around at all. There is some Roman coin that carries on being used. Sometimes this is pierced so people can wear it, which suggests it's no longer being used as money, at least by that point. There are some coins being brought in from the rest of Europe. So if there was an element of the economy that still used coin as coin, it was pretty small. Most coin that there was seems to have been serving other roles at this point.
Are we talking a few generations afterwards? It sort of fizzled out, and then coins would have been unfamiliar to somebody. Somebody's grandfather might remember coins, but they don't really see them very much. They become legendary.
That's basically true. Yeah, I think that's more or less how it happens, and it happens within 2-3 generations of the real collapse of Roman administration in Britain at the beginning of the 5th century, around about 410. There's actually a bit in the De Excidio Britanniae, this wonderful text by a character called Gildas, this clergyman who lived somewhere in western Britain, who wrote about the reasons Britain had been doing badly in the 5th and early 6th centuries. And he talks about coinage as a foreign imposition. It was something that in his mind the Romans had brought when they invaded, and they plunder Britain's resources, they make it into coins, and then they leave again, and they go back to what in his mind was the natural state of not using coin.
Oh, that's interesting. So he characterized coins as this newfangled thing that
pretty
should
much
be rejected.
Yeah.
It wasn't seen as unholy, was it, in any way? Was it religiously?
Not really, no. I think that discourse does come in, and there are elements of it in some writings at that time, but it's not really a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, it was one of the props of Roman civilization in most other parts of Western Europe. Britain is quite unusual in this respect, in that it abandons coinage more or less completely, especially in the areas controlled by the Britons still, the areas controlled by the people who'd go on to call themselves the English, the Anglo-Saxons. That seems to have been where there was still a bit more of this use of coin coming in from Western Europe. In the areas to the west of Britain, there's very little of that at all. What you do have is an interesting but very small trickle of Byzantine coins that are coming all the way through from the Mediterranean up into places like Cornwall, Wales, the Irish Sea, and that's part of diplomatic contacts with this very far-flung empire.
So coastal settlements, people travelling by boat, because I think coastal transportation by boat for bulk wines and things like that, I guess, sort of merchant adventurers coming with their fancy coins and posh wine.
Pretty much. In fact, the other thing that comes with the coin is an awful lot of ceramic pottery, which also comes from these various areas of the Mediterranean. And the theory is that it was bringing more or less exactly that. It was wine, it was maybe dyes, it was fancy stuff you put in pots, basically.
I wonder how that was seen by the locals, as these weird posh people with their, I don't know, would it be old-fashioned or would they be newfangled ideas? I mean, it'd be interesting to consider.
Yeah, well, it's very hard to know, because there's hardly any textual evidence from Britain in this period. You've got, by this stage, quite a good archaeological basis of coins, burials, settlements, all those things, but actually telling us what they thought about this stuff, what they thought about the coins, what they thought about the pottery, that's much harder to pin down.
Do you think that was a collapse of literacy then, to a certain extent? Presumably the religious institutions, were they retreating from literacy a bit at this stage as well, or is that just because the literate people left?
I don't think the religious institutions would have been retreating from literacy. I mean, I mentioned earlier this chap, Gildas, who is very, very educated. He's writing as polished Latin as anyone was anywhere in Western Europe. So some people were still learning and being educated to a very, very high standard. You probably didn't have as large a proportion of the population who was reading and writing, but you still had quite a few. There are lots of inscriptions being erected in Latin in Western Britain. I mean, it's really interesting. It's a time when different elements of Roman heritage, Roman culture are being sort of winnowed. You know, they're picking and choosing which bits they want to maintain. So they're still very Christian. They're very proud of being Christian, and it's probably in this period that paganism is being stamped out or close to it in what's now Wales and Cornwall and Western England. They're using Latin, at least for inscriptions, but coins goes away, cities go away. A lot of other things that were seen as quintessentially Roman in earlier times are just gone, but they do keep certain others.
Is that perhaps why, I mean, the term Dark Ages is out of fashion? You could argue it's out of fashion or inappropriate. I know it's a bit of I'm not an academic historian, I'm just interested in this. And I've always felt the term the Dark Ages is quite poetic. It's quite quasi-descriptive. It just describes the change after the Roman Empire, the Roman retreat. And I always felt it was quite beautiful in a way, but I think it brings with it quite a lot of baggage. Is it still secretly used in the academic community, sort of underground conversations?
Well, people do use it when they might want to make a rhetorical point. You know, they work from the assumption that everyone knows we shouldn't say Dark Age anymore, but they might say, well, actually, this bit where we know very little really is a Dark Age. And I think that most people use it in that way to mean a period for which the sources, usually meaning the historical sources, the textual sources, are very thin, when it's very hard to piece together a narrative of what's going on. You might have a lot of archaeology, and crucially, you might have plenty of evidence that it's not especially darker in terms of civilization, you might want to call it, in terms of people interacting with one another. It's not necessarily more violent, it's not necessarily more primitive or diseased or anything like that. And I think probably it's fair to say 5th and 6th century Britain were not all that much worse than Britain beforehand or Britain afterwards. I think that it's just that we really don't have as good a handle on what's going on in that period as we'd like to have. It's not necessarily worse, it's just that we don't know. So in a word, people do sometimes use Dark Ages for that particular period. They just squeezed it to the very beginning of the Middle Ages to try and get you over that hump where everything goes dark.
And then if we've got such a lack of written sources, does that mean there are surprising gaps in our knowledge? Do we know who was ruling certain areas, with certainty? Do we have gaps where we go, actually, these 50 years in this area, we actually don't have much other than we know people were living here and we have pots, but we don't know the name of the king, for example, or the queen?
Oh, yeah, that's commonplace. I mean, for much of Britain, we really don't have a clue how many kingdoms there were, who was in charge of them, what their dates were. That kind of thing is really just beyond our grasp. You've got later sources which sometimes like to say, oh, our kingdom was founded when this chap came over in a boat and hopped down and, conquered the woods, and that was that. The problem with those sorts of accounts is they tend to try and get you to the state of the kingdom as it was when the person was writing as quick as you can. They don't like the idea that there were other kingdoms around. They don't like the idea that things were more complicated in the early stages. And they don't recognize other kingdoms that might have been around them. Plus, there's a very strong tendency to think in terms of kings and kingdoms being the natural, desirable state of things. And it may not always have been that simple in the actual down and dirty reality of the 5th century. There have been other ways of running these societies, other kinds of titles, other kinds of structures that people were using. And this is true not just of the English, Anglo-Saxon areas, but also of the Western, later it became Welsh areas as well.
And of course, the idea of a king, we think of a king ruling over a country, and I think they were much smaller scale, weren't they? Kingdoms back in this early medieval period.
They were
they towns, basically?
Well, actually, they may not always have been so very small. I mean, you probably didn't have a united kingdom of, England or Britain that's just been lost to the sands of time in the 5th century. There might have been bigger units than we would like to assume, because there's a general sense among historians that you work up from smaller to bigger, that in the immediate aftermath of Roman Britain, things collapse into smaller units, which are probably, in many cases, about the size of a modern shire or county.
Okay.
We know this because some of the ones we know a bit more about, like Kent or some of the kingdoms that later emerge in Wales, are related to what were called civitates. That's civitas the singular. This is the word that gives a city in modern English, and it meant a city plus the area around it, plus the attached territory. And these were the subunits of Roman Britain. There were about 25 or 30 of them under the Romans, and those often, not always, but often provided the basis for the kingdoms that came afterwards.
So was there a sense of leaning on how the ancients did things, even with that concept, that this was done by the ancients, the giants or whatever the myth might have been of these big buildings that can't be built anymore, and that sort of somehow leaning on the authority of Rome to I'm the High King of Devon, you know?
A bit. I think there was a lot of interest in things left by the Romans. That includes coins, of course. There's a great bit in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in the year 418 where they talk about how in this year, supposedly, the Romans buried all the gold hoards, as they put it, that were in Britain and then left. Now, we don't know why they put it under that year, but what this strongly implies is that someone in England thought, gosh, we find lots of these treasures of Roman coins. That means somebody must have buried them. And they were thinking about why and when that might have happened, which is really interesting. It shows that they're very, very aware and conscious of this layered past that was under them, around them, above them when it came to buildings. There's a great poem, Old English poem, which is probably much later. It survives in a manuscript from the 10th century, but could be older than that. It's known to modern scholars as The Ruin. And it's all about a Roman building, a decaying Roman building, which has got water in it, got hot baths in it. For that reason, people sometimes think it might be referring to Bath itself, where you have the warm springs. And it's full of this fascination for the distant past, the built environment, these grander buildings that had been erected by those who came before us.
And is that where some myths started to take root, do you think, in the culture? Because King Arthur, and a very difficult area to talk about historically. But does the King Arthur story start to coalesce in this period at all?
Well, in the early Middle Ages, broadly, yes, but not actually in the era when Arthur himself supposedly lived, which would be the 5th and 6th centuries. No, Arthur first starts to be referred to in Welsh sources from the 9th and 10th centuries,
Okay.
But then in those early cases, it's very much allusions, brief mentions. The Arthur canon, the Arthur juggernaut, really only gets going in the 12th century and beyond. So they were very interested in this period in Wales, in England, in Scandinavia, in lots and lots of places across Europe. There was a lot of interest in the immediately post-Roman period as a kind of laboratory of nations. This is when our peoples first took root, when they established themselves. But King Arthur only becomes welded onto that process for the Britons later on in the Middle Ages. They were interested in other characters during the early part of that period.
Okay. How do you think Britain was seen by people on the continent? Because did the Roman retreat or the change in the Roman Empire, did that have ramifications on the continent? And were we seen as this weird place off the coast?
It depends exactly who you ask or whom you asked. There's a great text from Constantinople, so modern Istanbul, so heart of the East Roman Byzantine Empire in the earlier Middle Ages, where in the 6th century there was this character called Procopius, who was very closely linked to the Emperor Justinian, and he wrote quite a lot of sort of historical geographical texts, which are wonderfully rich and gossipy. And at one point, a couple of points, in fact, he discusses Britain there, and for him, it's the stuff of legend. You know, it's a place that exists, but he talks about how the souls of the dead go there. He talks about it as a place which for him is a little bit like how people in England in later times imagined Asia, you know, that's got all of these giants and strange creatures and supernatural goings on there. You know it exists, but it's far enough away that you can picture really weird stuff being associated with it. And Britain plays that role for Procopius. It's a signal that it's still just about in the Roman world, but on the fringe. It's not something they're in regular contact with or that they think about as a place you might ever want to go.
I love the idea that to reinforce that, those white cliffs, which you could probably see on a clear day, there's this weird mythical place where you get tin from, and the natives are all dangerous, and they're probably mythological as well. And you can see the fact that there's a part of it that's white. That's really weird. And if your propensity is to make up tales, which quite frankly is very human, I just love the idea there's a little bit of physical convincing there that that makes it visible.
Yeah, I mean, that could well have been part of it. I mean, obviously, if you lived in what's now France, you would have had much more direct contact with Britain. It probably didn't seem nearly so weird or wonderful. We know that there were political links across the Channel, there were marriages across the Channel, there was trade, there was migration of people going back and forth. It was much more part of the landscape, and there was constant contact across the Middle Ages, even in this period of the so-called Dark Ages.
So going back to coins and going back to sort of more prosaic, so ordinary people in the high medieval might have coins and stuff, but in this sort of early medieval period, coins disappeared. How did they function? How did they manage to purchase things? Was it entirely barter? Was there some other substitute for abstracting value?
It's a very good question, and it's an area where you can learn a lot from how anthropologists and economic anthropologists have thought about this in recent terms, because you're quite right. In the past, people always assumed if you don't have coins, it must be barter, as in, I have a sheep, you have a cow, and, it's a match made in heaven. I get your cow, you get my sheep. Difficulty is, what if you don't particularly want a sheep right now, or I don't want a cow right now? That's where the difficulty lies with a system of pure barter, and it's why, in fact, it's thought that systems of that kind probably were very rare and certainly weren't where exchange began or where it reverted to. Instead, it was basically credit. It was basically a matter of people saying, well, okay, you have a sheep, I have a cow. My sheep is worth, 5 gold pieces. Your cow is worth 6. And then we'd exchange them, and I'd give you some other grain or whatever to make up the difference. Or I just remember it, and then you'd pay me back at a later time. I think that's much more likely the way people did things. And it's really important because it means that people probably carried on thinking in terms of money, probably even thinking in terms of coined money at times when they didn't use it very regularly, used it very rarely, in fact. Spain is a good example of this because there are rather better written sources from there than from England in this period. And what you see in Spain is that people hardly make or use any coins of their own, at least in the northern areas ruled by the Christian kingdoms where we've got lots of charters from. And yet they carry on using the same denominations as had been there for hundreds of years already. Going right back to the 6th and 7th century, they still talk about the tremesis, which was 1/3 of the standard Roman gold coin, the solidus, right down into the 10th century, maybe even beyond. And yet nobody had made a tremesis since about 700. So, people think in money.
So these are almost abstracted concepts. So there wasn't actually a coin backing it up, but there was a value associated. Okay, that's really interesting. On a modern basis, I can remember in Italy, spending some time traveling around Italy during the time they transitioned to the euro. And one of the huge problems was houses were valued in a certain number of lira. And when the euro came in, it was changed by a factor of 100.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a house going, is that really expensive or is that actually really cheap? I can't work it out. So for quite a long time, I think they may still do this, somebody might know, they still kind of had lira values, even though it wasn't actually the currency, because everybody needed it to kind of judge value.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think things like that must have been commonplace in the Middle Ages, where people think in terms of units which you would never actually touch. You wouldn't touch a shilling or a pound. They didn't have shilling or pound coins in the early Middle Ages. Those only come much later. And yet people used them routinely to measure the values of houses, of livestock, of slaves, of their own honor, all these things. It was actually a very, very monetized society. People were very aware of these things. They just didn't actually use coins very much to settle the obligations they had to each other.
I was always wondering about the fractions of coins. We often value things at $5.99 or, $22.99, and you think that's really 23 actually, isn't it? We all know, except it screams 22 plus almost a whole nother one. Did they have fractions of value of things, or was it a cow is worth 3 units and a sheep is worth 2? There's no concept of anything being worth half or a quarter of anything.
They did do that. I mean, of course, if you're thinking in terms of pounds or shillings, the virtue of those is that they're made up of so many subunits, so many pennies. I mean, one reason why the traditional shilling was 12 is that that's divisible between 3 and 4. You know, you can divide it up in lots of ways so you can get fractions quite easily. And those units, the abstract units, were highly amenable to that. The coins themselves could also be used to create these fractions. They sometimes made smaller denominations, although that was rare in this period. There are some halfpennies that were made. There was also a phase in northern England, the Kingdom of Northumbria, in the 800s, the 9th century, when they switch gradually to a base metal coinage. They debase their silver so much that eventually the coins are just made out of copper alloy. And there are vast numbers of them that have been found. Unfortunately, there's absolutely zero evidence from Northumbria about what effects this had on prices, whether there was inflation or anything like that. So it's really just guesswork, but there's a strong chance that this did lead to coins of lower value that were a little bit more like what you just said, the lira. You know, you have to think in terms of tens or hundreds rather than single coins. And if you get into the late 900s and 1000s, they quite literally cut silver pennies into halves and quarters. So you get an awful lot of these still being found nowadays, the cut halfpenny, the cut farthing.
So literally a half a coin clipped through.
Yeah, precisely.
Or a quarter of a coin.
Yeah, this accounts for maybe, well, especially if you're in a city or somewhere like that, maybe half the coins that you'd find in an excavation from this period would be cut up like that. It seems to have been just very commonplace.
Wow. And then, of course, it's only ever going to be a quarter.
Yeah.
So if you want to, I suppose you've got to find another quarter to get a half. And, you know, you'd end up with a handful of bits.
That's true. But the other way you can handle this is by kind of turning it around, because obviously you can't sort of slice a sheep in half and have half a sheep, but then they are more valuable anyway. They're normally going to be a higher unit. So you've got the potential to work with halves of shillings or whatever it might be. But what people would sometimes do with, say, bread or other, you know, sort of retail goods like that, is you'd make your loaf to be the size of a penny's worth of flour. You'd vary the size of the loaf rather than the amount of money. That seems to have been pretty common.
I see. So, yeah, 1 token gets you a loaf worth 1 token. And
exactly, yes.
The loaf size will change.
Yeah,
right.
Precisely. Yeah, there's good evidence for this from the later Middle Ages, when sources for this kind of thing just become much more plentiful. But it's very, very likely that this was already being done in the earlier Middle Ages.
So is this a form of early shrinkflation, where you buy a packet of crisps or something and you suddenly realise it used to be 125 grams and now it costs the same, but it's 100 grams and it seems suspiciously empty?
It is, that's true. But at the same time, when you do get evidence for prices in the period I was looking at, and there aren't that many prices, but what you can see is that there's remarkable stability in the long run, that the prices, or at least the compensation that's listed for things like a sheep or a cow, that stays the same over periods of 200 or 300 years. There'd be short-term fluctuation when you've got things like famines or other immediate crises, but there was a lot of long-term stability in prices.
Oh, that's interesting. So short-term, you know, there's a harvest failure and therefore the price goes up, but then the next harvest comes in and the price descends back to what a loaf of bread should be. We're very used to, in the modern world, in the Western world anyway, we're very used to this idea that prices are always going up.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, that seems to be sort of embedded in our system. But back then, literally, you could go from one generation to the next and a reasonable quality cow would be the same value outside of emergencies.
Yeah, no, it seems very difficult for us to wrap our head around, but it was indeed the case that underlying prices were generally very stable. There was a bout of general inflation that kicked off in the late 1100s in England and some other parts of Europe. But before then, there'd been a long, long period of stability. And yes, this meant things were much the same.
Was that artificially controlled? Was that constrained by law? Or was that just the strength of tradition? Or the fact that we had an economy that was basically kind of not growing as such?
I think it's a bit of all those things. There was growth and change in the economy, but it happened at a fairly slow speed. And this meant that prices were kind of built in. The population was relatively low. It was very agrarian. I think those factors also contributed to this stability of prices, by which we mean mainly things like grain and livestock. But yes, I think it's the result of a whole host of things coming together, and that there could be lots of other changes going on, even though the prices for these basic commodities remained stable.
Did we ever have any civil unrest because the price of bread went up more than everybody hoped? Is there anything like that in the record?
You certainly get that in the later Middle Ages. There are examples of that from later medieval France, which is interesting because that's a place where there was a lot more manipulation of the currency, where the kings were debasing the coins but keeping the face value the same, and this then offset value so that things were inflated artificially. That happened a lot in France in the 14th and 15th centuries, and then in England in the 16th as well. But in the earlier Middle Ages, it looks like that didn't happen so much. There was sometimes civil unrest, but it was very unusual that there wasn't, especially in England, very much peasant resistance at all. There's hardly any cases of peasants revolting and saying, we're not happy with the state of things, we're not happy with the prices, we're not happy with stuff in general. You could interpret that as saying the peasants were just happy with their lot, sitting on their little farm, growing their grain and doing all their peasanty things. But I think it's also quite likely that any unrest just didn't make it into the record. And if it did take place, it was driven by other things. It doesn't seem often to have been unrest at the economy or the system at large. It's directed specifically at landlords who've been trying to squeeze too much money out of their tenants or something like that.
Okay. So going back to coin debasement, does that mean the authorities, the king or whatever, the exchequer, gathers up all the nice coins, melts them down, chucks in a whole load of copper, and then mince them? Or do we get phases where there are good coins and there are bad coins kind of mixed in, and everybody doesn't want the bad coins, but the good coins run out?
You got both those situations at different times and places, and they both caused problems of their own. And there were other ways that you could handle this too. There was a practice used in some parts of later medieval and early modern Europe where you just arbitrarily declare that, say, all 50p's in circulation are now worth £1, and all pounds in circulation are now worth £2. That was something that was done occasionally with horribly destabilizing consequences. And you also had plenty of examples where rulers called in all of their existing coins of better quality, then they melted them down, and they basically turned one good coin into 2 or 3 bad coins by adding in copper or iron or something else like that. And if you have got old coins mixing with new, that can lead to people sort of hoarding the good ones and trying to get rid of the bad ones as quick as you can, because you're more worried about people not accepting those. You want to try and keep the good ones back. This is sometimes known as Gresham's Law, after an Elizabethan minister who, he wasn't the first person to do so, he was one person who talked about this phenomenon in England in the 16th century, but it had been going on in different times and places for a long time. It probably happened in England in the 860s, because at that point there were 2 major kingdoms in the south. There was Mercia, which was the Midland Kingdom, and there was Wessex, which is the kingdom south of the Thames, Alfred the Great's kingdom. And this is in the years running up to Alfred becoming king. Mercia was making a very large coinage, and they had debased it significantly. The West Saxons had also debased their coins, not quite as much, but heading in that same direction. And these 2 coins looked different, but they circulated side by side. One of the West Saxon kings decided that he was going to try and improve his coinage. He wanted to restore its quality. He wanted to restore its fineness. This was Alfred's brother Ethelbert, and it's probably happening in about 863, 864. And so he makes these new coins of much better quality, but they're very, very rare. Hardly any examples survive now. And what you see just a few years after that is when he dies and another brother comes along, he says, oh, well, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're just going to adopt the exact same design of coins as the Mercians. It's a matter of you can't beat them, you join them. And so instead of having these high quality coins that were being rejected, or rather being hoarded and not used and falling out of circulation, they decide instead they're just going to toe the line of this Mercian coinage. It's a sort of monetary race to the bottom.
Absolutely. So coin debasement is something that the authorities do, as I understand it. Coin clipping, that sounds like a different phenomenon. That's literally slicing small pieces off the edges of precious coins. Is that right?
That is absolutely right, yes. It's the practice of taking coins from, well, any pre-modern mint where they'd be made by hand, by striking bits of metal with a hammer, and inevitably they'd end up being a little bit irregular, some more so than others, and this gave potential to trim the edge, and if you did that a lot, you could gradually accrue quite a lot of silver. And there were other tricks for doing this too. One other method was called sweating coins, and this involved taking very, very fresh silver or potentially gold pieces as well. You'd put them in a bag quite loosely, and then you'd give the bag a really, really good shake. And after that, the coins would get a little bit worn, little bits would come flaking off them, and you'd take out all of the coins, and then you'd have a little bit of basically silver or gold powder, silver or gold dust left in the bottom that had worn off them as you shook them. And then if you did that again and again and again, you could build up a bit of gold and silver. Now, what's interesting is it's hard to pin down those practices taking place in the early Middle Ages. There's not very much evidence, at least from England, of people actually clipping coins. And the reason for that is that already from around about the year 770 or so, they tended to make their coins using something a bit like a pastry cutter. They'd make the bits of metal using something that was very round. And this means that the large majority of surviving coins from after then, made in England, are actually very close to perfectly round. And it would be patently obvious if you had tried to shave a bit off the edge. So it doesn't seem to have been that big a problem. It is a much larger issue if you go onwards into the Central and later Middle Ages, where the coins are being made slightly differently and there's more potential for that. But in the early Middle Ages, Anglo-Saxon times, they were deeply worried about forgery from a kind of ideological point of view. The kings talk about this a lot in their laws, but hard evidence for this actually happening is very limited. It seems to have been a sort of scary prospect rather than something that was really happening on a large scale.
And I think one of the things with coin sweating, I suppose, immediately occurs to me that it would be hard to tell if it had been done artificially or if it had just in use. They'd been circulating a lot. So you couldn't really say to somebody, that coin looks a bit more worn than it should be.
That coin's been sweated.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is why it was seen as a particularly pernicious thing to do. I mean, crimes against currency were seen as a very big deal in the Middle Ages because they were an offence not just against, not just against a single person. They were offences against the whole of society, against the king, against everything that your society stood for. You can see the evolution of this in a passage in different lives, saints' lives, written by this character called Dunstan. And he was an Archbishop of Canterbury in the 10th century. There's a life written of him not long after he dies, which says nothing about him dealing with dodgy moneyers at all. Then there's another life written of him about 75 years later by a monk at Canterbury, which just says very briefly that at one stage he judges and condemns to death 3 forgers of money, but leaves it at that. But then another 30 years after that, in the early 1100s, there's a character called Eadmer who writes a longer, more detailed life of Dunstan, which really goes to town on this episode with the dodgy moneyers, the people who are forging coins. And he has a long speech about how this is such a crime against the king, against everyone else, how it's a loss to the whole of society. They're really, really concerned with this, and that concern only amplifies as you go through time.
Were people executed? So literally you're saying he somehow was in charge of declaring these people should be executed. So it was a capital crime then, was forging?
It depends on exactly when and where you were, but yes, it often was a capital crime. In earlier times in England, the penalty for forging coins, for offences against the currency, was to have your hand cut off and your testicles cut off, and the hand would then be mounted on a spike on top of the building where you had committed the crime.
Yeah, it kind of put you off doing it a little bit. I mean, the testicles is quite bad too.
Yeah, well, it was very public. It was meant to be a deterrent. People would see this and they'd think, eek, I should not do that. We also know that in France at the same time, if somebody was convicted of another related crime, which was refusing good coin, it wasn't just a matter of forging coins, but refusing coin that was actually good quality, you would be branded on the face with the coin you had refused. It would be heated up and then used to burn you on the face.
Wow. I always wonder how many people were going around with that kind of mark on them. It just makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Unfortunately, we have no idea. It must have been at least some, because the text that tells us about that is a document that one of the Carolingian kings, King Charles the Bald, actually sent to a specific group of judges that he was sending off to deal with a case of this. So evidently he thought this was going to happen and probably had happened at some point in the past. And we know that some people in England did have that punishment of the hands being removed as well.
Oh, wow. So if you were a merchant dealing kind of across borders, how would you deal with the different types of coins? Was it purely on weight? Was it on weight of precious metal? Is that the fundamental value of a coin?
If you crossed borders, then yes, they generally would become reduced to how much gold or silver is in the metal. That might be modified a little bit based on matters of reputation and convenience, because basically if coins turn up and everyone can see these are genuine English coins, they don't need to spend as much time testing them as if they were some other wacky coinage they're not familiar with. So it could be modified a little bit, but yes, broadly speaking, if people go from one jurisdiction to another, you'd be treating your currency just as metal. Whereas within the state where it's made, it would carry a premium. It would be accepted at a higher value, basically just so that people don't treat it simply as bits of metal and melt it down and stop regarding it as coinage. They would start thinking of it just as little discs of silver.
Because I'm vaguely thinking of the Vikings here and the concept of hack silver. Is that related to money?
It is indeed. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And hack silver is a little bit different. Hack silver is, in a sense, a kind of purer system of that, in that you recognize that everyone's just using silver or potentially gold and copper alloy as well, based on purity and based on weight. Now, on the one hand, that means you've not got the sort of hand of the state lying on you quite as heavily. You can do business with anyone, anywhere. Your silver is theoretically good wherever you might go, and you don't need to worry about changing it into coin and losing money along the way.
That sounds very Viking and freebooting. That kind of fits in their kind of public persona in modern culture.
Exactly. No, it does. And it's got a lot of advantages to it. The downside to it is that it makes the actual process of handling transactions a bit more cumbersome and a bit more fractious. Because if, say, we were Vikings and we want to do a deal in a market, we don't know each other, we might have all sorts of suspicions. You know, is your silver good? Is my silver good? Whose scales are we going to use to weigh it? Whose will we use first? Do you look like you've got more armed henchmen behind you than I do? You know, there are...
Who's going to win the argument if we fight? Yeah.
Pretty much. And there are a couple of cases in sagas where they talk about precisely this, where they say that there are people engaging in a transaction with silver of varying quality, and sometimes they disagree or they get offended about the quality, and it says this, that they come to blows or they almost come to blows, and it illustrates very well this limitation that there was to a bullion economy, that it was very versatile in general, but it had a cumbersome element on an individual basis.
Oh, it's interesting because it's purely pragmatic. We're traveling, we're raiding, we're going to get all sorts of weird coins and things. So what we're going to do is we don't care what it says on the coin. We're just going to weigh it. We're going to assess it for quality. We're going to weigh it, and then we're just going to extract the value of the physical material. I mean, were we on precious metals until relatively recently? I mean, this isn't medieval. I mean, the value of precious metals is the coinage system for a huge amount of time, isn't it?
Well, quite, yes. Right down till Nixon, you know, in the US, it was still notionally based on gold.
Right, so very, very modern, yeah.
Precisely, yes. And since then, the dollar and most other currencies have been kind of floating. You know, they're not pegged to gold or silver anymore. But historically, yes, precious metals played this special role as a kind of underlying basis for value. And there are some people who would like to go back to that. It did have some advantages, but it also had a lot of drawbacks. And in the Middle Ages, there was a strong sense that there had to be some gold or silver somewhere in the process. You know, somewhere there ought to be hard physical value. You could have credit, you could have all sorts of systems of deferred exchange, you could have abstract units, but people needed to think it corresponded to a certain amount of gold or silver. And often that there was, especially if it was as it were, outright credit, a document that I write saying I want to pass on this amount of money to you. They think there should be gold or silver behind it somewhere predictable.
And I suppose the reason for precious metals having value is they're just hard to dig out of the ground. Is that right? The metal is literally mined.
Yeah, I mean, gold is really only valuable because it's shiny and people like it, and you can't get it that easily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is what's been its attraction for millennia. Same to some extent with silver, that it can serve some practical roles, but above all, in economic terms, it was really just desirability and scarcity that set it apart. And that made it suitable for fulfilling that role.
And gold doesn't tarnish, so it keeps going,
Precisely, yes. It doesn't diminish over time. It's one bit of gold going to be more or less the same as another bit of gold, as long as you've got the weight and the fineness right. Whereas if you wanted to base your economy on, I don't know, onions or goats or something like that, it's very, very hard to pin down a standard onion or standard goat. That was one of the challenges people faced in a lot of these early societies. What are we going to use as a way to rate our value systems? What is something that's consistent that we can all get access to?
And I suppose one of the arguments about coming off the gold standard, and again, this is probably outside both of our areas of study, but I feel one of the areas is that having to have a physical thing like a precious metal kind of constrains the scale of what you're doing in some ways, and it sort of limits you because there's only so many tons of gold, and therefore that's the maximum value. I'm probably making modern economists scream at my simplicity. But
well, I do have some friends who I know would have strong views on this, but you're absolutely right that if you have to actually move coins or gold or silver, it makes the operation more complicated. I mean, this is often thought to be one of the reasons why in the later Middle Ages, in the 13th and 14th centuries, people start to develop more elaborate tools of credit, basically the forerunners of things like checks and letters that convey money from one person to another, because it means you can go from Florence or Venice to London or the Champagne fairs in France, and you don't need to bring with you a whopping great big sack of gold, which is difficult to carry, which is going to make you a target for thieves, which is really just a bit of a pain. And so instead, you would have a contact or a member of your family that was based there, and you'd write them a letter, they knew and trusted you, and they could then pay the money on your behalf. That was where this system started. And you got wonderful cases from the later Middle Ages where the Pope or someone like that would move X amount of money from one location to another. And we know that actually moving the money sometimes cost up to nearly half what the money itself was worth.
Or physically moving it because of the security needed. And
that's right, yeah. You need a wagon, you need people to move the wagon, you need food and water, you need people to guard it, you need enough people to guard it to deter the baddies who will be living out in the woods and the places where it will go. It's a big operation.
I don't know whether there is a story like that, but there's an obvious story there, which is you set off with a huge bag of gold to transport it somewhere, and along the way it's slowly whittled down until it's an empty bag and the money's been spent and there was no point doing the journey in the first place.
A bit like that. There is actually a wonderful story about basically early traveller's checks, which is a bishop from Passau in what's now, I think it's Austria, and he's called Wulfgar. He wants to go to Rome, and what he does is take with him a few great big ingots of silver. And every time they get to a new town with its own form of money, because of course in Italy especially at this point, every city has got its own different monetary system, they just lop a bit of silver off these ingots, take it to the local mint and have it turned into some coins. And it saves them having to change one actual batch of coin into another, and they get reasonably good rates as they go along, and it just makes the whole thing a bit more practical. It's still not that practical by our standards, but relative to the other options, it was a good choice.
I love that idea. You slowly, you say, just make me some silver coins in the right denomination, please, for this particular moment of my journey.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Well, look, this has been absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. We could keep on chatting for ages. Was there anything I've missed out that you wanted to sort of tell our listeners particularly about medieval buddy making and that kind of stuff?
Well, I think we've touched on lots of the major themes that are in the book, which is great. I suppose I'd also just like to say that I mean, money is obviously an economic phenomenon, but it's also a social and an institutional one. And it tells you a bit about how governments worked. It tells you about how kings wanted to present themselves. It shows you one of the very few areas of the medieval economy where rulers could actually step in and present themselves and be in some sort of touch with the mass of the population. This is a time when you don't have radio, TV, internet. You don't really have that many mechanisms for a king like Charlemagne or Ethelred the Unready or Alfred the Great to actually pass on information to their people. But coins did. And so what they put on their coins, how they represented themselves, how they controlled the quality of the coinage, this wasn't just a matter of, numbers and money. It was also a matter of symbolism. It was a matter of prestige. It was what you thought your king could be, what you thought your kingdom could be.
So a matter of propaganda on the coins in a very strong way.
Very much so. Oh, yes, very much so.
Imagine being somebody living in the middle of nowhere and somebody offers them, it's like, oh, a new coin. We have a new king, do we? Yeah, absolutely. He looks kind of quite strong at fighting. He's in a kind of outfit and he's got a helmet on and a sword. Sounds great. Yeah. Is he any good? I don't know. But his new coin seems okay.
Well, pretty much. I wouldn't be all that surprised if conversations kind of along that line did take place.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. So the book is Making Money in the Early Middle Ages, if people are interested in that. Do you have social media that you would encourage people to, if they want to hear more about your work?
I do, yes. The main one that's probably pertinent to this is Blue Sky. I'm also on X, but Blue Sky is the one I use most nowadays.
Okay. And what is your handle on Blue Sky, if that's the right word?
I'm Rory Naismith, all one word, bsky.social.
Wonderful. Really appreciate it. I loved having a chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jason.